Welcome to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going from Genesis to Revelation through all the chapters of the Bible, breaking down a summary of the chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. Today, we're on Genesis 13, which is the start of Abram dwelling in Canaan. You don't want to miss what this chapter tells us about God. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into our summary of Genesis 13. So in this chapter, Abram, Sarai, and Lot, they leave Egypt and they return to Canaan, where they had built the altar, where Abram had built the altar previously. So earlier, if you remember in the last chapter, Abram had went with Lot and Sarai to Canaan. He built an altar there. God promised them the land, but then due to a famine, they went to Egypt. And then now they have come back from Egypt, back to the same place he had originally built the altar. Lot and Abram's servants end up arguing during this time, and they're together. They have a lot of servants. The Bible actually says that they're rich, that they have a lot of money, a lot of cattle, and a lot of servants. And their servants start arguing, kind of family gets together, starts bickering back and forth. And so Abram, to bring peace, makes a deal with Lot and says, look, you look at the land, choose where you want to go, you and your servants go there, and then I will take whatever you don't take. And so Abram lets Lot choose, and Abram's going to go the other direction. Of course, Lot chose what looked to be the best land, what looked the most beautiful, the most lush, the most well taken care of land. And he chose that for himself, which ended up putting him close to the area of Sodom. And Abram ended up dwelling in Hebron in Canaan. So you have Lot and Abram separating, Lot going towards Sodom, and Abram dwelling in Hebron. And the Lord promised after that the land and seed, that all the land that he could see, so Abram could look around from side to side, everything he could see would be his. God even told him to walk the land, and where he walked, that would be the land that God gave him, and promised that his seed would be as much as the dust of the earth. Now, you would have great seed. Now, this is, again, impossible because Sarai is barren. So keep that in mind as we continue. God continues to make this promise to him, and he continues to believe God, even though it's clearly impossible. So some key takeaways from this chapter. Number one, Abram was rich and had a lot of gold, silver, cattle, and servants, the Bible tells us. He came out of Egypt rich. He actually, the likelihood is that when they dwelt in Haran, previously with his father, over time he gained servants and, worked and ended up gaining a lot. So Abram was well off. He had the resources he needed for him and his family to survive there in Canaan. So he had all these resources. And I think it's interesting, though, that even though he had all this stuff, Abram wasted the most valuable resource to him, and that was time. Look how it describes it. So Abram starts out in Canaan, the land that God promises him, builds an altar there. Everything's great. But because of a famine, chooses to leave and go down to Egypt. God didn't tell him to go to Egypt. He went down to Egypt, got into trouble because he lied and didn't trust God. So he lies, and then being there in Egypt, his wife gets taken. There's this big, huge issue, and finally leaves Egypt and comes back with his wife and Lot back to the exact same place he started, right where he built the original altar. Had he stayed there and trusted God, time wouldn't have been wasted. So Abram had all these resources, but wasted the most valuable resource he had, which was time. Abram's failure to follow God's command led to conflict. This is very interesting. So there's conflict between Lot and Abram and their servants. Now, God didn't command him to take Lot with him. Remember, God told him to leave his father's house. That includes Lot, which was part of his father's house. He should have left Lot. He should have never taken Lot with him to begin with, or his father. So he delayed time in Haran because of his father. Then he ends up with delaying time in Egypt. And then he ends up with Lot and his servants arguing and bickering back and forth, leading to conflict. And he ends up having to separate from Lot to begin with. And then this leads to further conflict that we're going to look at in just a few moments, or in a few chapters. But isn't it interesting that God commanded him to leave his father's house? He didn't. And as a result, there was conflict that didn't need to exist simply because he didn't fully follow the command of God. He did what God told him, go to Canaan, right? But he didn't do it in the way God told him to do it. And that led to some issues. Also, we see that Abram learned a lesson in Egypt. He didn't have to make things happen. He trusted God, which is why he gave Lot a choice, right? He went to Egypt and had to lie and lied about his wife and trying to make things happen to spare his life and to make sure that he was alive to see the promise of God happen. And that, well, now he learned from that. He's back in Canaan, and he doesn't feel like he needs to make the promise of him possessing the land happen. He lets Lot choose what land he wants. He kind of puts it in God's hands and says, I trust God that God's going to take care of it. I'm not going to try to make this happen, which means he did learn something from his time in Egypt. So while it was wasted time that he didn't need to waste, God has a way of taking our wasted things and teaching us something out of it, letting us grow from it. So very important lesson he learned in Egypt. And then we see that Lot dwelled in the land that looked best. So he actually tried to take advantage of Abram. Abram gave him a choice. Instead of saying, here, Abram, God gave you this promise. You take the best land. I'll live over here. He tried to take the best for himself. That selfishness rose up, and he tried to take advantage of Abram. So we see this conflict again. Obviously, we see God made the promise to Abram. Abram, while not perfect, was righteous and seeking after God. Lot, clearly, we don't see that Lot was seeking God in his decisions at this time. So we can clearly see there's some conflict and tension arising, again, from a decision to bring Lot when he shouldn't have. So some things that we learn about God from this chapter. First, we see that God honors his promise. That God promised Abram the land. He didn't go back on that promise even after Abram wasted time, lied, caused all kinds of issues. He never went back on that promise. He still honors his promise even when we don't honor our end of the deal. He allows us to go through consequences for our choices. This is very interesting. So God didn't step down and intervene and send Lot to a different direction and give Abram the best land. God allows us to go through the consequences of our choices. He didn't stop the bickering. He didn't stop the fighting. God didn't intervene there. He said, you brought Lot along. You made that choice. There's going to be consequences that arise from that, and you're going to go through that. And I think this is very important. Yes, God intervenes at times. Yes, God comes in and steps in and doesn't and intervenes in our life at times. He delivers us at times. But many times we make choices, we go through the consequences of those choices, and then we want to blame God when it's really our choices that led to the consequences. So we need to be aware of the fact that our choices have consequences, and there are times where God's going to allow us to walk through the consequences of the choices we make. And it teaches us something. Number 3, he blesses you even after others take advantage of you. So others took advantage of Abram. Lot took advantage of him, took the best land. God blessed him and said, you know what? All this is yours. Look, everywhere you put steps, that's yours. Everything you can see, that's yours. I'm blessing you, even though it looks like you've been cheated by Lot. He also redeems the time. Even though Abram wasted the time, we don't see any effect in that wasted time where it impacted the promise coming to pass. Right? God redeemed the time for Abram. And finally, there's this concept of progressive revelation that over time, God reveals more and more. We've seen it in the past 3 chapters. God first tells Abram, go to a land that I'm going to show you. So then Abram has to go on that little bit of revelation that God's going to show him land and has to choose to follow. Then after that, there's more revelation that comes. Hey, I'm going to give you seed, and this land's going to belong to your seed. Okay, so I believe on faith in that. Then God gives more revelation. Anywhere your foot walks is going to be yours. Look around, everything you can see. There's the boundaries of what's going to be yours. So you can see that God slowly reveals the plan to Abram over time. There's this progressive revelation. God doesn't give you everything at the exact moment you want it. It'd be easy if God just said, here's the plan. But nope, God slowly gives it out. Why? Because God wants you to trust him even when you don't have all the details. 5 things we learned about God. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you dig into this chapter, seek God, encounter God. Until next time.